I had to say to myself, okay, this is actually not a faith that's asking me to take a blind leap of faith or to park my brain at the door. And that was very important to me because I was already studying philosophy. I felt that would lack integrity. And I had to come to the conclusion, this is a faith that's asking me to love God with my mind. And that at least opened the door for me to pursue that further.
Hello, and thanks for joining in. I'm Jana Harmon, and you're listening to Side B Stories, where we see how skeptics flip the record of their lives. Each podcast, we listen to someone who has once been an atheist or skeptic, but who became a Christian against all odds. You can hear more of these stories at our Side B Stories website at sidebstories.com. We welcome your comments on these stories on our Side B Stories Facebook page. You can also email us at info@sidebstories.com. We always love hearing from you. As a reminder, our guests not only tell their stories of moving from disbelief to belief in God and Christianity, at the end of each episode, these former skeptics give advice to curious seekers as to how they can pursue the truth and reality of God. They also give advice to Christians as to how best to engage with those who don't believe. I hope you're listening in to hear them speak from their wisdom and experience as someone who has once been a skeptic, but now as a believer. We have much to learn from them. There is a common idea in our culture that religion, at its foundation, is nothing more than a fairy tale to help those who are scared of the dark, that faith is blind, that only uneducated, weak people believe. There's a sense that religion is nothing but merely wishful thinking for those who aren't themselves thinkers, that Christianity is a man-made religion with no connections to facts, reality, history, or evidence. But that begs the question, what of those who are thinkers, who are academically accomplished, who take their beliefs seriously as something substantive, worth believing, and for good reason, for something more than wishful thinking? Are they all deluded, as the skeptic might suppose? Or could it be that an intelligent, thoughtful, serious-minded person may actually have investigated the claims of Christ and Christianity for themselves and found it to be convincing and true? This especially raises eyebrows for those who were once skeptics of faith and then find themselves to become one of Christianity's most passionate proponents. Such a dramatic shift from disbelief to belief causes you to lean in and question what compelling evidence it must have taken to cause someone like that to change not only their views about God, but change their entire life, helping others to see and know the truth about Christ that they found. Today's story is just that. Vitale was a thinking skeptic who did the hard work of investigating the claims of the Christian worldview and did not find them wanting. Rather, he became convinced that they were not only true, but they led him to the author of all truth, Jesus Christ, and that his life has never been the same. Come and listen to his fascinating story. Welcome to Side B Stories, Vince. It's so great to have you with me today.
Oh, it's wonderful to be with you. I appreciate the invitation.
Excellent. So the listeners can know a little bit about you, Vince, before we get started. Can you give them an idea of perhaps where you live, a little bit of your life, maybe your academic background and the things that you're involved with now?
Sure. I live currently in East Palo Alto, California. I've been here for just over a year. My wife, Joe, and our two kids, Raphael and JJ, now 4 and 2 years old. We were in Atlanta before that. We drove out here in our little Kia, and at the time they were even a bit younger, so once you include their 2 car seats and the pack and play and the stroller, there wasn't much room, so it was quite an adventure.
Oh, I bet.
But we loved it, and seeing a lot of the country. We've been out here for about a year now. We're part of a house church community that has really been family to us, welcomed us with open arms after a difficult season in our lives. So we've been so thankful for that, and just felt like this has been a place of provision for us in a time when we really needed it. And we're close enough to the beach that I can get out to surf every couple weeks, which is a particular joy of mine. So I'm very thankful for that as well. Before that, we were actually in England. My wife is from England. We met in graduate school there. I was there for 12 years. And then before that in New Jersey, which is where I was born and where I grew up and stayed through college.
So you graduated both Princeton and Oxford, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, Princeton was my undergrad.
And what was the focus of your study?
It was both philosophy and theology, religion. I mean, interestingly, I got to Princeton not as a Christian, but somehow knowing that I wanted to study philosophy, even though I had never taken a philosophy class in high school. It wasn't offered at my high school, but somehow I just sort of knew those are the types of questions I asked. It was sort of the way my mind worked. And I've always felt there was a faithfulness of God in that, and that he kind of put me on a trajectory that aligned with what I ultimately was called to, even before my heart was in a place where I could understand why that would be the case.
Wow, that's fascinating. Really interesting when you can look back and reflect on that and see God's hand in your life and the way that you were guided. And one other thing, don't you have a new opportunity in your life, something to do with Unbelievable?
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Janet. I'll be one of the hosts for the Unbelievable podcast, which I'm really thankful for, especially because I feel like those types of conversations, as I assume we'll get into more even on this podcast, conversations between Christians and non-Christians in a constructive manner was such a big part of my own story. The questions I was asking initially, it would have been very easy for Christians to dismiss me, and they didn't. They actually disagreed with me really well. And so that's part of my story.
Wonderful. And we will, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Unbelievable podcast, we'll put a link in the episode notes so that you can find it. All right. Well, it's yes, it sounds like that you have had an intriguing life. I am curious, as someone, obviously you're a deep thinker. Even if going into college, you knew you were asking big questions. So let's back way up. Let's start in your childhood. And Vince, tell us about what your family home was like. Where did you live? Where did you grow up? Was God a part of that picture? Did you go to church? All of that. Let's start there.
Sure. Okay, I grew up in New Jersey, Italian-American cultural background. I guess if you had asked my family if we were Christians, people would have said, well, of course, we're Italians, therefore we're Christians. It's part of the ethnic heritage, sort of an important part of the ethnic heritage, but didn't generally reflect what we believed or how we went about our lives. And from a religious perspective, again, it was sort of cultural, ethnic, something we didn't think about too much throughout the year. And then at like 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, somebody would say, you know what, we should go to midnight mass. And then we'd sort of gather up everyone, and that like sort of once a year, maybe we would go to church. So I don't remember as a young person meeting many people who thought very seriously about questions of faith, or for whom belief in God made a very significant difference, in terms of whether people believed in God or not. I wasn't able to discern a significant difference in terms of what life looked like. So I guess that's a bit about my background and maybe why I was asking big questions of life, but not clearly coming to the position of belief in God.
So it was just something out there that you did on occasion on Christmas, and not much more than that. But again, you refer to yourself in a sense that you were a question asker. You were inquisitive, and even as a child, I guess you were starting to just think about things, think about life or questions. What kinds of things were you thinking about?
That's right. I mean, as you were saying that, I was just remembering. So I came across this letter to Santa a number of years ago. It was actually written on a paper plate. So I have this paper plate. It's all yellowed around the edges. And as kids, my brother and I, we used to put letters in the chimney, and then Santa would, whisk them away, and we would hope to, get what we asked for from Santa. And so one Christmas, I think based on the writing, I was just learning to write cursive. And so I think I was probably like 6, 7 years old. And I wrote on this paper plate, "Dear Santa and God, comma,
Okay. Yeah.
was God ever born?" And I put it in the fireplace. So there's a couple of interesting things about that. One, at a very young age, I'm realizing there's some difficult questions. Like, there's a little bit of explaining to do when it comes to God. Okay, like, was God ever born?
Right.
If not, can something just not have a beginning? So I was sort of starting to ask questions like that, which explains a little bit the philosophy education later. But it's also very interesting that I wrote "Dear Santa and God,"
Yes.
because I think in my mind I had trouble pulling them apart. They were conflated. Santa and God were both people who kind of could see the way I was acting, was keeping a record, of good and bad. You didn't want to be on their bad side.
Right.
You might get good things if you're good. You get bad things if you're bad. And but they come by, again, maybe we go to church once a year. They come by once a year, and they don't stay long enough to say hello. It's not something that would be relational,
Right.
but both, Santa and God were both kind of this far off, disconnected thing in my mind. So, yeah, that paper plate in some ways encapsulates my early childhood. I was asking difficult questions, seeing that there were these difficult questions that needed to be explained in some way if God was going to make sense, but also having a very thin understanding of who God might be and having trouble differentiating between Santa and God. And so then I think, at some point when Santa didn't exist, when I learned that Santa didn't exist, it then sort of raises the question, especially if you think of Santa and God as very similar. Well,
Right.
okay, if that was just a myth, then maybe this is just a myth as well.
So is that kind of where you landed there for a while? It was again just this concept that perhaps was a childish way of thinking about good and bad, and I want to, maybe it was motivating me to be good for a little while, but that's not really real. So you just
Yes, I think that's right. I think when I started to ask some of my hard questions about God to people who believed in Him, I often didn't get very robust answers. Maybe I had some reasons to question why would God exist if Santa didn't. But it was also convenient for me because I wanted to be my own God. I didn't like that. I didn't like the idea of someone being superior to me, being better to me. I wanted very much to have control over my own life, and very much had, I think, a philosophy of life, which was you take control of your own life, you work hard, you are successful, you win. Life is one big competition. You're better than other people. You work to be the best, and that's where your value comes from. And so if you, in a sense, surrender control of your life to someone else, well, then how am I supposed to have any value? Because all of my value comes from me controlling things and putting in the effort and therefore being rewarded with things because of what I've achieved. So there were things going on in my culture. There were things going on in terms of my family background, beginning to ask hard questions and maybe not getting robust answers. But it also was convenient for me to not take God very seriously because of the way I wanted to be at the center of things.
So it was easy to leave behind and blaze your own trail, I guess, especially, like you say, as someone who's driven towards achievement. So as you were growing up, you were pushing kind of those kind of questions to the background, at least with regard to God and religion and faith. I'm curious, as you were growing up and had just maybe dismissed that, did you give any thought to really what that was? Was that just, what was religion? As a thinker, I'm thinking, okay, if that's not real, if that's just perhaps made up, or nobody really believes it, what was religion in your mind? All these people who went to services on Christmas, what was all that even for? What was that?
Yeah. No, that's an interesting question. I think to some extent, I probably felt like it was something for the weak to some extent. Sort of you needed someone else to tell you what was true about life. You needed someone else to do the things for you in life that you can't do for yourself. I remember even at times in my youth coming up with kind of like my own philosophical, spiritual, metaphysical, whatever wording you want to use, kind of paradigms, for what was valuable in life and how you were supposed to order your priorities. But it was very much like Vince, in the late 20th century, as an individual, I'm going to figure out the way it's supposed to be. I'm going to figure out the correct philosophy. Everybody else has it wrong. And now of all the billions of people who have lived, sort of, again, because life was one big competition. And in sports and in academics, I had done well at things. And so it sort of reinforced this idea of, okay, yeah, that's a way that I can see the world, and I can do well, and I can have value, because I can do well at sports, be better than other people. I can do well at academics, be better than other people. And so now when it comes to the deep questions of life, okay, let me sort of create my own philosophical mindset and say, okay, nobody else was kind of smart enough to figure this out yet, right, in the history of the universe. But sort of now I've figured out, and it sounds very silly and arrogant, and it was, but it's kind of the natural conclusion, kind of the natural place that you come to if you think life is all about one big competition. Then whatever it is, sports, academics, or your philosophy of the universe, you need to create it yourself, and it needs to be better than everyone else's. And yet, even during this time when I think I was, resisting God in my heart in a really serious way, I now look back, and there are a few moments where, probably many moments when he was reaching out to me, but there are a few that I now look back on and think, whoa, like how gracious of God to interact with me in that way, give me that experience at a time when, I had my hand out to him saying, no, thank you. I mean, just one example, I was in high school and I rear-ended the car in front of me. And so we get out of the car, and the man says we should exchange insurance. And so I go back to the car. I'm thinking, oh, this is terrible. I go back to the car. I get my insurance. Feel sick to my stomach. We walk towards each other. I go to give him my insurance card, and it's like something just stopped him. I would now say like the Holy Spirit just stopped him. And he looked at me and he said, you know what? He said, my family's going through a really hard time. Why don't you just agree to pray for us, and we'll just leave it at that?
Oh, my.
Yeah.
That's unusual.
And unusual, right? And at the time, like now I reflect back on that, and I think, what an incredible encounter. Like, here's someone, like, my mistake had a cost. It had a cost for him. But he was the owner of that car. He had the right to say, you know what? I'm going to take this cost on myself. He still had to go get that car repaired. And in taking that cost on myself, instead, I'm going to invite this stranger who's done nothing but actually harm me and my property into a relationship with me and my family. I mean, it was this beautiful depiction of the gospel. At the time, I wouldn't have been able to put any of that wording to it. But I did walk away like deeply moved and thinking that is not how I would have responded in that situation. There's something going on in that guy's heart which is different from what's going on in my heart. So even amidst all of this, keeping God at arm's length, God was very gracious in reaching out to me in a variety of ways.
Yeah, that was a beautiful picture of grace. But it sounds to me that you were like, I think a lot of people, all of us find ourselves in this situation, and many times we're independent, we're fine on our own, I've got this. You obviously had some skill, some talent, athletically, intellectually, you're able to achieve where you wanted to achieve. And so it sounds to me as if you had no felt need for God. Like you say, that you were the strong, you were the one who's got it in control, you're the one who's going to figure it out, and that you had no need of God. And I think a lot of people find themselves in that place. They don't need the control or the interference or however they perceive God to be. But yet you got this amazing picture of like you were in a little place of need, and yet
Yes.
you received grace. That's incredible.
That's a great way to put it. That's absolutely right. I think that's what it was. It was God, prodding me, trying to show me you do have need. You do have need. You couldn't take a breath if it wasn't for me. And part of it, I think, was you have to do quite a bit of self-deception to get to the place of feeling you don't have any need. And part of that for me was always rationalizing that I had been right and other people had been wrong. When there was conflict in relationship, when I had hurt people, it couldn't be the case that I was actually wrong and in need of forgiveness, even in need of a savior. So I needed to use my persuasive abilities as a budding philosopher to always convince others and convince myself that I had been in the right and they had been wrong. So I think you're right. I think I was in this place of not thinking I had a need. Part of that was because circumstantially I had been able to be good at some of the things that you're told to be good at as a kid, but then it also required quite a bit of self-deception on my part as well, to sort of always find a way persuasively, philosophically in my head to place myself in the right and other people in the wrong.
Right. Yeah. I think sometimes it's easy to put ourselves in that place, isn't it? You had mentioned that even prior to going to Princeton, that you were kind of a young man who liked to think about big ideas, and that going in to Princeton, that's why you pursued philosophy. What kinds of questions or ideas were you considering, even as a high schooler prior to college, that made you want to go in that trajectory?
Oh, yeah. Testing my memory now.
Yeah.
But I remember thinking about questions like, where did everything come from? Which I still think is an amazing question, and one that people spend far too little time thinking about. Sometimes we can go our whole lives without taking a few steps back and going, where did all of this come from?
Right.
And the intricacy of it, like the fact that we're sitting here as cognitive beings talking to each other over a technological platform that's somehow beaming stuff through the air. I mean, it's all just incredible. So I think I had maybe it was God-given, an innate sense of like awe and wonder at the reality of life, and that caused me to think hard about things. I think I thought quite a bit about love and purpose. Some of the big questions of life. I thought about what it meant to live a good life. Like what was the good life? There was quite a bit of sort of idealism, I think, in my childhood as well. That sort of, partly because I hadn't dealt with much suffering yet. I had been good at the things I put my hand to, and so there was this kind of sense of anything is possible, which I now think is true with God because of His power, not because of my power and my abilities. So, there was this sense in which a lot of what I was striving towards in my thinking, in my mind, there were remnants of truth in it, but they didn't make fully sense if I was at the center of the universe and I was the one who needed to both come up with these answers and live out the ideals that I had in mind.
Right. So yeah, if you're skeptical of God being present or pervasive in this world in any way, I would imagine trying to figure out some of those big questions and issues would have been somewhat challenging. without that kind of a source of reality. Did it when you were kind of asking those big questions, and even going into Princeton when you're starting into a rigor of asking those big questions, did that prompt you to think, well, how is all of this possible if God doesn't exist? If he, did it cause you to kind of reconsider that as an option, as more than just a Santa Claus figure that you had dismissed?
Yes, I think so. At least to the extent of, did there have to be some sort of cause to the universe? Did that cause need to be intelligent in some respect? But even as I began to think about some of those questions, even as I began to take philosophy classes at Princeton, it was also still very convenient for me to keep any conception of God that I might have, or I don't know if I would have used that language, even any conception of kind of a first cause, as still quite detached and far away, more of a deistic understanding, something that would allow me to explain certain things that seem to need explaining, but also wouldn't have much bearing on my own life,
right.
Wouldn't infringe on my life and my control of it and the way that I wanted to live it. And probably I thought more along those lines until I came into contact with Christians and a Christian community in particular, where I think up until then it was like, well, I have some thoughts about these big questions of life, and everybody else does too, and nobody has very much confidence in them, and I've been able to kind of reason better than most people to this point, so my thoughts are probably better than most people's thoughts. And then I encountered a community of people that had a confidence about their understanding of the universe and God's place in it that was drastically different than anything I had experienced to that point, and that caused a lot of cognitive dissonance for me. I didn't know what to do with that, and they seemed in a much better place than me with respect to their understanding of and their experience of reality, and probably even the sort of competitor in me was bothered, by that, and knew I needed to do more thinking.
Yeah. So who were these people exactly, and how did you encounter? And because oftentimes especially if you think that you're fine without God, and the religious believers are a little bit weak-minded and those kinds of things. I'm just curious, how did your paths cross? I'm presuming you're speaking of Christians that you encountered, or some kind of community of Christians. How did that happen, actually? Yes.
Who were these people that turned my life upside down?
Yeah.
Who were they?
Right.
And it's amazing. It's in some ways it's a superficial answer. Soccer teammates.
Okay.
It's one of the amazing things about sports is that you bring together in not just a superficial way, but in quite a kind of deep, we're bonded to each other way, a great diversity of people, all because we happen to be able to kick a ball reasonably well. And so I was on the soccer team as a freshman, just starting at Princeton, and there were two sophomores who were serious about their faith, who were Christians. I didn't know this at the time. They invited me to a meeting of Athletes in Action, which is a Christian fellowship. I didn't know what a campus ministry was. I didn't know what a Christian fellowship was. I didn't know what the word evangelical meant. I mean, all of this would have been outside the box of my awareness. I knew it was something Christian, and I had sort of, kind of cultural Christianity in my background. But the bottom line was it had athlete in the title, Athletes in Action, and I was being invited by two teammates of mine. So that was enough for me to go along. We were a few minutes late to this first meeting, and I remember walking in the back of the room, and one of the most impactful, split seconds moments of my life was when I walked in and I saw these Princeton students, peers of mine, other people who had sort of fought their whole life to be the best and to be praised as perfect. and they were singing their hearts out to this invisible God. And I instinctively, immediately knew whatever these people mean when they say that they're Christian is different from what my family and cultural background means by that term. And then I began to just observe this and even listen to the lyrics of some of the songs, and I realized these Princeton students are praising, worshiping this God precisely because of how much greater he is than them. But remember, my philosophy of life was that life was all about being the best, being better than other people. If somebody was better than you, that made them an enemy, and then you had to do everything you can to try to top them. And here were these successful Princeton students humbling themselves, singing their hearts out in this intimacy, treating God like their best friend, when the fact that he was greater than them should have made him an enemy. So I don't know if I could have put all that language to it at the moment, but I do think that that's what I was experiencing and what I was feeling. And I walked out of that meeting, and I can remember that I began to pray an agnostic's prayer. I thought, these people know something and have experienced something that I don't know and I haven't experienced, and that bothered me. And I can remember sort of philosophically reasoning to myself that if there is a God, he would honor a prayer of this sort. God, I don't know if I'm talking to anyone, but if I am, I would really like to know about it. And I began to pray that prayer after my experience at that meeting.
Was that prayer answered in any way?
It was eventually. And that was a process. And I'm so thankful for this community that came alongside me, this Athletes in Action community came alongside me in that journey. I was challenged to read the Bible, starting with the New Testament. I hadn't really read through it before, and was challenged to read before I made a decision about faith. And when I first began to work through this Bible that I was given, I would actually I would cross things out when I disagreed. I would add things when I thought I knew better, and I actually had this old Bible where I'd write a big BS in the margin, where I disagreed, not for Bible study,
right?
Unfortunately, and so looking back now, I think, well done, Christian brothers and sisters. Because I would have been so easy to dismiss. Like, here's a guy, like, we tell him to read the Bible, he's literally crossing things out and writing BS in the margin of his Bible.
Right.
It would have been easy for them to just say, hey, let's move on to the next guy. This guy's just, too far from that. He's too arrogant in his own thinking.
Yeah,
but they journeyed with me.
But how amazing that you actually took the challenge and you opened the Bible and you actually read it for yourself rather than just presuming what you knew was in it or dismissing it out of hand. You actually opened it and started reading. The things that were giving you trouble, were they the miraculous, the seeming supernatural, or like, this could never have happened, that kind of thing? Or were there also some surprises, like, this is not what I thought it was, this is more historical in nature, this is... Or any thoughts? I mean, what were you thinking as you were reading through the Bible for the first time?
Yes, all of the above, and I like how you point out. But hey, you did take the challenge, and even in that, there's a real graciousness of God, because it was probably partly my competitiveness, which in some ways had been my downfall in terms of my understanding of spirituality and what was in my heart, and yet even that God was able to use as part of my story. I wasn't gonna, maybe I wasn't that interested, but nobody challenges me, and I don't do it. So I'll take the challenge. I'll read the Bible, and I'll read it I'll read it faster than anybody else read it. So I didn't like the idea that other people knew the Bible better than I did. They were able to speak with competence about the Christian ideas in a way that I was not able to. So, there was probably very mixed motives in my heart, some good, some bad, but God was able to use even that. and I began to read through, only having read snippets before. I found myself very drawn to the person of Jesus, the way that he carried himself, the way that he treated people. You who are without sin, throw the first stone. Pray for your enemies. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Do to others as you would have done to yourself. And I'm reading all of these noble lines, and I'm attracted to the person of Jesus. But then, like you said, I then get to claims of, virgin birth and resurrection, and I think in part I just thought it's just too crazy. It's too crazy to believe. But then I took the challenge and I kept reading, and then in particular when I got to the Acts of the Apostles, that history of the early church after the Gospels, I started to come across all sorts of words that I never expected to see in the Bible. Words like examined and convinced and explained and debated, even proved, persuaded. I read that the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians. Why? Not because they took some blind leap of faith, but it says because they examined the scriptures daily to determine if what they were being told was true. And the more I read through, in particular Acts of the Apostles, and saw how much the early church was spending their time reasoning with people and saying, this is believable, by the end of that book, I had to say to myself, okay, this is actually not a faith that's asking me to take a blind leap of faith or to park my brain at the door. And that was very important to me because I was already studying philosophy. I felt that would lack integrity. Right. And I had to come to the conclusion, this is a faith that's asking me to love God with my mind. And that at least opened the door for me to pursue that further.
I'd like to take a moment to pause and tell you about my new book. In this culture of increasing skepticism towards conservative forms of Christianity, what motivates atheists to believe in the reality of God and become passionate followers of Christ? Through the views, lives, and stories of 50 former atheists, I've written a book that takes a broadened look at their religious conversions, not only to answer the question, what would it take for an atheist to become a Christian, but more clearly, what did it take? The most intriguing question of all. This book is written through years of talking with former atheists and includes what I've learned about their journeys from atheism to belief in God and Christianity. It's called Atheists Finding God. I wanted to take a broad look at their conversions, to consider a wide range of influences that cause someone to hold and yet change beliefs. We take a look at atheism, atheists, and what they believe about themselves, their own views, their own lives, and what they think about God, Christians, and Christianity, and why they reject it all. We consider how and why they turn from resistance to openness towards considering the possibility of God. We look at their questing towards belief, their conversions, and the amazing life transformations that follow. Importantly, much of what is written is through their own words, their perspectives, their stories, their voices. Whether you are someone who is skeptical of belief and believers, if you've moved from skepticism to Christianity, if you are moving from Christianity towards skepticism, or if you are someone who just wants to understand more deeply and engage more meaningfully with non-believers, I think this is the book that is for you. It is worthwhile. Right now, the publisher, Lexington, is offering a 30% discount on both hardback and ebook formats. In order to get the discount, you'll need to use a promo code and call them or connect with them on their website, and I will include all of that information in the episode notes. You can also find it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but without the discount. If you're interested, again, I will include the necessary information for ordering in the episode notes. Again, the name of my book is called Atheists Finding God. I hope you'll read it. Now back to our story. Wow. So you invested enough to be willing. It sounds like curiosity, competition, challenge, at the beginning, but then there was something that grabbed you. Of course, the person of Christ grabbed you, and then the narrative grabbed you, and then the intellectual, seeming intellectual rigor of it somehow grabbed you. And so take us along this path. What happened? Did you continue to, obviously you're wrestling with some difficult issues of what you're finding, but I guess it's still pulling in you in the direction of towards belief.
Yes, and at this point, it's a whirlwind going on in my mind as I'm trying to get my head around all of these new ideas and keep up with my classes and sports. But you're right, I was grabbed by the person of Jesus, and that kept me investing. Even by the time I got to the end of the Gospels, I realized, boy, Jesus made some really incredible claims about himself.
Right.
And maybe having read snippets, I knew that to some extent, and I probably thought, people probably made up a couple of those later. But it wasn't until I read through in its entirety that I realized these are all over the place. There's dozens of them,
and
where
for those who are listening, what kinds of claims was Jesus making about himself?
He's claiming that your eternal destiny is dependent on what you believe about him. That if you believe in him, even though you die, you will live. He's claiming that he's Lord of the Sabbath when it is talking about what we're allowed to do on the Sabbath or not. The Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments from a Christian perspective, and he's the Lord. He has authority over the Sabbath. He's referring to himself most frequently as Son of Man, which I learned around the time refers back to Daniel 7 and this sort of eschatological picture of God coming on the clouds of heaven as the Son of Man. He claimed to exist before Abraham, who existed thousands of years ago. So all these claims, he claimed to forgive sin, not to sin against himself, but to just be able to blanket make a statement that someone's sins are forgiven. And that's a very weird claim. If one person sins against another, I can't just pronounce that the person's sin is forgiven when it's not even against me. All of these claims, and I feel like the force of that when I read through the Gospel straight through and saw that there are dozens of these types of claims popping up, I thought, boy, there's a really good case to be made that historically Jesus was making some absolutely radical claims about himself, which leaves you with only so many options in terms of how you think about him. He could have been a vicious liar, but it would have to be a vicious liar because he knew full well that his best friends were getting persecuted and ultimately going to be killed for believing what he was telling them. It could be that he was severely mentally ill and had deep deceptions about who he was, and that just doesn't align to me with the composure that you see in his life throughout the Gospels. It could be that he's actually telling the truth, which seemed remarkable, but if you don't have any other good alternatives, then all of a sudden it becomes viable. So that was significant for me. I kept reading. I got to 1 Corinthians 15. The Gospels had spoken about Jesus' resurrection, but then in particular, when I got to 1 Corinthians 15, and there's this list of people that Jesus appeared to after he clearly had been killed. And I learned around the time that scholars take much of that beginning of 1 Corinthians 15, and in particular the content of it, to be extremely early, to be dated to within months or a couple of years of Jesus' death. Not just Christian scholars, but scholars in general. And that was extremely significant for me because I had just sort of assumed that the idea of a resurrection would have been something that developed in a legendary way over time. Nobody really believed that in the first generation, but probably 6, 7, 8 generations later, you have slow incremental changes, and now people believe something crazy. This passage, this early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which predates the letter, it confronted me with the reality that in that first generation, there were many people who were walking around utterly convinced that they were spending time with this man after he clearly had been killed. And so it then raised the question, what explains that? And I understood that from a Christian perspective, that is explainable by the actual resurrection of Jesus. When I then went looking for other alternative explanations, I found them to be very wanting or even non-existent in many cases. And so again, sort of gradually, through this process of reading through the scriptures and thinking my way through the scriptures in the context of community, I was coming more and more to the realization that this is a rational faith. This is a faith that can be defended, and it's quite amazing. In the same way that the apostles were doing in the Acts of the Apostles. Acts 17, it also says God has provided proof to everyone by raising Jesus from the dead. And that's what they were persuading people of in that first generation. And now 2,000 years later, I'm reading through and having conversations with Christians, and it's the very same arguments that are having an impact on me.
So it sounds like through your study and through your conversation with those who were informed that you yourself were becoming more convinced that perhaps God exists and Jesus is God and that he died and rose again, and that resurrection was not just some historical event, but it meant something for you personally.
Yes, and that's why it was so significant that I was going through this intellectual process, but it was in the context of a community that I was observing. And again, I don't know if I could have put this language to it, but I think it was almost like I was saying, okay, this is what the conclusions that my reasoning seems to be coming to. In the community that I'm seeing live together, am I seeing lived out in practice the conclusions that I'm coming to here? If it really was a resurrection from the dead, if the scriptures are actually accurate in saying that the same spirit that rose Jesus from the dead comes to live within the believer, am I actually seeing a difference in this community that would make sense of that? And over time, I found that was the case, aligned with the conclusions I was coming to by reasoning things through. That really made me feel this makes sense in my head and it makes sense in my heart. And that's what I would expect. If God made all of me, then he would want his existence to make sense to me in a holistic way.
So, I'm sitting here thinking of this young man who, prior to coming to Princeton and meeting this amazing community, you were a young man who you described yourself as arrogant and, again, pursuing self-achievement and,
Yes.
Competitive and not wanting anyone to tell you what to do, basically, that you had it figured out. Now, when it comes to this Christian community and seeing the humility involved with their faith, like you had described earlier, that they're worshiping a God who's bigger and greater and grander than they are, and that somehow they had submitted themselves in worship yet to this person, Jesus, who received worship. He claimed to be God, and he received worship, and that somehow he's worthy of that.
Yes.
And I'm thinking how were you might have been wrestling with coming to grips with the idea of, well, what if this is true? What does this mean for me, for my life, for the way that I see myself, the way that I see my own life? Are these, C.S. Lewis says, is this the hound of heaven, kind of coming to interfere, break and be the iconoclast who breaks all of my,
Yes.
My preconceptions of who he is and who I am. And I'm sure that there must have been some wrestling, or was it just a simple kind of like, no, this is true, and somehow, like you say, in your heart, that you kind of turn towards, no, this is really what I want. If this is true, then your desires kind of conform to that reality.
Yes, I think it's a very perceptive question, because I probably could have gotten to this point in my journey and still never really surrendered myself to Christ. I could have gotten to a point of intellectual assent and even like admiration for Jesus and for the community that he had set up, or that I had experienced in this context, at least, without there actually being this sense of like you said, humbling myself and actually worshiping Jesus. That was another step on my journey. And for me, it really came later in my journey. This happened over a period of about 9 months from when I first went to that meeting to when I actually gave my life to Jesus. But later in that process was a point where, and I think the Lord just knew when the right timing was for me, when I sort of knew enough to experience this in the right and most helpful way. But I really felt conviction of sin in my life. And in some ways, really for the first time, in a deep and sustained way. Again, because I was so adept and in the habit of rationalizing and explaining away my sin beforehand. But now it was clear to me, and I think that was a gift of the Holy Spirit, it was clear to me that certain things were wrong in my life, certain things I was doing were wrong. And I can remember so now I'm in sort of like two worlds, right? The Holy Spirit sort of convicting me of sin, but there's still part of me that's like, but I'm in control, I'm powerful, I'm the divine one, I can make what I want of my life. So I had this conviction of sin from the Spirit. I sort of accepted that, and I can remember thinking to myself, okay, well, if now I believe that that's wrong, I'll just stop doing that. On my strength, I'll just sort of flip the switch and we won't do that anymore. And I can remember trying to do that and falling flat on my face. And then thinking, okay, I obviously didn't try hard enough. Okay, now I'll try harder. Flat on my face. Okay, now I need to try as hard as I possibly can. Okay, let me try as hard as I possibly can. Flat on my face. And it was sort of that first time in my life where I came to the conclusion and was willing to accept the conclusion that I'm actually weak. There is sin in my life that I am helpless to do anything about or to even understand fully without the help of someone who's greater than me. And that was very much the most significant place that I needed to come to in my heart. And I think it was really essential that I came to that place before I made a commitment to Christ. I had to get to a place where I was ready to see Jesus as my Savior. I think before then, I might have even been willing to say, look, logically it makes sense. Rationally, yeah, he's God. He's the one that actually created the universe. But that's different than saying, and I required saving, and he saved me. So that's a very important part of my story.
Yeah, sometimes it just is a process, isn't it? And I think sometimes we need to be patient with ourselves and with others as they're trying to figure things out and are moving in the direction of God. I think, and I love your honesty there. It's very transparent because we're all guilty. I think the word says we're all guilty, and we are.
Yes.
And we all need saving from ourselves, and that takes such a posture of humility that is oftentimes for all of us unnatural. It's an unnatural state. But once you get there, it seems like there's a lot of freedom that comes with that, and a burden that is lifted once you give that burden to Christ. So I'm wondering, I'm sure your life changed quite a bit after you came to that place of surrender, not only in your life and in your pursuits and the way you answer questions, but it probably, in a sense, as a thinker, I would imagine asking these big questions, you can see how the reality of God really does bring things into focus in terms of it does help answer the big questions of life. As a philosopher, how is it through being a believer in Christ, you believe the word, that it's not for weak-minded individuals. It's actually pretty robust of
Yes.
worldview to believe in. How has it shaped your understanding, really, of things intellectually and in your life?
Yes, I love that you used the word freedom. That's probably the word that most characterizes what my experience was of making that decision to surrender my life to Christ. Not everyone has a specific moment, but for me, there was a moment in my dorm room. I was in 122 Jolene Hall, and it wasn't. I was reading a book at the time, but it wasn't like there was something very specific in that book. I think God just knew it was the right time in terms of the process He had taken me on in both my head and my heart, and in the context of community, to give me the gift of faith. And I just somehow knew in my spirit, in a way that so far transcended any of my calculations or philosophizing, that God was real, that Jesus was who He claimed to be, that He was present with me, that He loved me, what He had done for me. Nobody was in the room, but I dropped to my knees and I exclaimed out loud. I said, "Oh my gosh, this really happened!" And freedom, I think, was the experience. And since then, this freedom to stop competing to be loved and to start enjoying it. There was no rest. There was no rest before that, because I always had to compete, for my value and to be loved. And now I could rest in that and just enjoy being loved. And yet, I competed harder than ever, whether it's on the sports field or with my academic studies. But it actually wasn't a competition against other people. It was an opportunity to worship God in gratitude for what He had given me. Now it's like, whoa, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this for the God of the universe. So, interestingly, sometimes people think, okay, well, God gives us our value. God loves us no matter what. So we don't really need to work hard at anything. At least my experience was, I felt the freedom to work harder and to really pour myself into the things that I was passionate about, because now it was, whoa, this is not just like my individual preference. This is a calling given to me, by God. There's something eternal about this. The good things will last, for eternity. They're not just transient. They won't just pass away. This isn't just for myself. This is honoring someone who has done so much for me, who gave their life for me, and this is my opportunity to give my life back to them in service. So I found that there was a freedom, a rest, but even in that rest, a passion to pursue the things that I had been inclined to with even more tenacity.
That's so beautiful. What a tremendous paradigm shift, really, in the way that it's not like you say, I appreciate that you're still not working. You're working hard, but it's with a different lens. It's with a different perspective and a different motivation. And you're still striving for excellence. It's just the motivation is different. Yeah.
That's right. And the goodness of God, that, again, He actually wove into my story, things that He had given early on in life, even when I didn't know what to do with them, like an ability to persuade. From a young age, I was good at persuasion. I debated with people a lot, but I generally just used that to my advantage. How could I persuade people that I was better than I was, persuade myself into a situation, persuade people that they were wrong and I was right. And yet there was something in the persuasion that was good. It was just corrupted. And now in the context of my Christian life, I wound up on a missions trip, and I didn't know what a missions trip meant, but I just knew we were going down to this conference. I knew it had a Christian element to it, but it was actually a trip where you walked the beach and shared the gospel with other people who were down there for spring break, looking for lots of things other than hearing the gospel. But an older brother in Christ sort of took me under his wing. We walked on the beach. He gave me a couple opportunities to just share about what God was doing in my life and the journey I had been on. And as I did, There's one man whose face I can still remember because as I shared with him, I don't know exactly what happened in his heart, but I remember seeing in his eyes like something was making sense. Some sort of burden was falling away, and there was kind of a clarity, and he was seeing Jesus more for who Jesus really is. And it was like in that moment, I knew that's what I was made for. I knew I was supposed to spend. I didn't know exactly what forms, but in one way or another, I was supposed to spend the rest of my life telling people about Jesus and persuading people of Jesus, not in a manipulative way, but sharing with them the truths of both the mind and the heart that I had experienced. And so there's just this beauty where I sort of knew in some ways that I was geared towards persuasion. That's why I was already choosing to study philosophy before I ever came to faith. But now it was like, oh, now I get it. Now I understand why I have such this inclination towards persuasion, because you've actually, built me to share you with others. And I would have been just chasing, an imperishable crown of getting people to think better of me or getting myself into situations I didn't really deserve to be in. Now I'm actually using the same gift, but for an imperishable crown, for things of eternal significance. So I was so thankful for that. And yes, a lot changed in terms of both my intellectual perspective on things and my personal experience of life. One of those things for me, which I'm so thankful for, which was about asking for forgiveness, because before I came to faith, I would never ask for forgiveness, never, ever. Because that meant I was wrong, which meant I wasn't better than other people, which meant I wasn't valuable, which meant I wasn't lovable, and go down the whole spiral.
Right.
So I couldn't ask for forgiveness, and so I then had to live with a lot of self-deception about why I was right and other people were wrong. And this was partly cultural in my sort of Italian American background. In my family, people really didn't do reconciliation. They got mad at each other, and then they didn't talk until no one could remember why they were mad in the first place.
Yeah.
And then one person would show up at the other person's doorstep with a tomato plant, and and it was always a tomato plant, Italians, and then they'd be like, "Oh, brother," and then they would hug it out, but no words exchanged, no apology, no forgiveness, and then things would just kind of move forward. But all that to say, the week that I came to faith, one of the next mornings, I woke up with a flood of conviction about ways that I had hurt people in the past. All instances where previously I had rationalized to myself, got myself to believe that I had been in the right and they had been in the wrong. And now the Holy Spirit was giving me actual clarity of thought about these situations and where I had actually hurt people. Not condemnation, but conviction, almost a freeing conviction, the freedom to actually live in reality and acknowledge truth. And I felt this compulsion to sit down, and I began to just write letter after letter to these people, acknowledging ways that I had hurt them and apologizing. And I saw God do some beautiful reconciliation and peacemaking through that.
I bet.
And have sort of, fallen in love with forgiveness given and received.
But as someone, again, just to remind our listeners, you are no slouch when it comes to intellectual rigor, and that you went on from Princeton to Oxford to pursue a degree in philosophy there at the doctoral level. So what prompted you to do that?
It's the goodness of God that I was already studying philosophy. He, even when I was not following him, sort of set me up to be able to do that, to study something that was aligned with what I was called to. And so my interests became more and more theological, but retained the philosophical element as well, and I really got into philosophy of religion, arguments for and against the existence of God, questions about the nature of God, some of the questions that really can act as obstacles to people taking faith seriously, some of which acted as obstacles to me taking faith seriously. And so I had a passion to study those questions, really because I began to share the faith with people after that experience on that missions trip at the beach. And as I would share the faith with people, people would then have questions sometimes very good questions, sometimes very hard questions. And so, for me, it wasn't it wasn't just a philosophical interest in questions for the sake of questions. I did have that kind of naturally. I feel like God maybe gave that to me because of what he was going ultimately to call me to. But really the primary motivation to dig deeper in this area was sharing the faith and people asking questions and realizing part of what it meant to love them well would be to take their questions seriously and try to provide them with good answers. And so even though I was studying philosophy at an academic level, I always thought of it as part of my service to actual people that I was going to meet in a taxi or an Uber or getting a haircut or in the context of community in some way.
Yeah, that's pretty beautiful. Again, your heart was directed towards God-centered purposes, and how that is a sacrifice in itself, that kind of rigor that you experienced, but it was for the sake of the Lord and for others. That's amazing. And I'm thinking, Vince, of those who are intellectually driven, and or for personal reasons have resisted the person of God, think they're fine without him. But yet, curious enough, maybe your story has sparked in them an interest to think, well, maybe it is true. What would you say to someone like that who might be willing to move towards maybe reading the Bible or even saying that agnostic's prayer or something? How can you encourage someone who is, it sounds like you have these kind of encounters with skeptics a lot. So what would you say?
Yeah, thank you. One encouragement I would give would be not to dismiss Christianity because it seems crazy, not to dismiss it because it makes extraordinary, incredible claims. I think that was a mistake that I made. It was almost like all the different philosophies or worldviews were lined up on a race on the starting line, but Christianity starts like 3 steps further back than everyone else because it makes these claims about a virgin birth and a resurrection from the dead. And I think that was bad reasoning on my part. And so I would encourage people not to think that way. There's so many things in the world that just are extraordinary. Even at the moment, some of our best versions of quantum physics suggest that the same particle can be in 2 places at once. Like, that's crazy, But when a quantum physicist says that, we think, cool. But when a Christian says that God is omnipresent, that he can in some significant sense be in various places at once, we think, oh, that's too crazy to believe. Actually take a step back and think that through. Even when you think about that question that we started with, where did all of this come from? There's only 3 options. Either God created it, it just burst into existence out of nothing for no reason whatsoever, or it's just always been here. It just extends infinitely back in time in this universe or through a series of universes, but again, with no explanation for why that's the case. And from my perspective, I'm willing to put my hand up and say, okay, the Christian, the idea of an immaterial God creating the universe, that's extraordinary. That's awe-inspiring. I'll put my hand up and accept that. But criticism without alternative is empty. Maybe that's the phrase I would leave people with. Okay. Don't just criticize the Christian faith because you think it's extraordinary. Think through the alternatives. And you might come to the conclusion that you think, boy, Christians believe in a virgin birth. That's extraordinary. But you know what? I sort of believe in the virgin birth of an entire universe because that's the best scientific explanation I have for it. Wow, that's extraordinary too. I think we live in an extraordinary world, and so we shouldn't be surprised if the explanations for that world are quite extraordinary as well. So don't dismiss Christianity. Actually look into it. Don't criticize without having an alternative, whether it's the beginning of the universe, origin, or whether it's questions of meaning or destiny or purpose or morality. Put the different ways of seeing the world side by side. And even if one seems quite extraordinary, say, okay, what is the alternative? And if you can't find an alternative that answers all the questions of life in such a robust way and in such a coherent way, then I think you really need to take Christianity seriously. And maybe one more thing I'd say, Jana, if that's okay,
Sure.
is I really believe that I resonate with what Pascal said. This is sort of a paraphrase, but he said, God's given us enough evidence to believe rationally, but not so much that we can believe based on reason alone.
Mm.
And I think that's because he doesn't want just intellectual assent. He wants us to use our minds to pursue him, to seek him. He wants our whole selves. He wants that. But also at the end of the day, he doesn't want people who just intellectually assent to him. He wants us to know him in a deeper way, in a relational way. And G.K. Chesterton said there are two ways to choose a coat. One is to look at the dimensions of the coat, what size it is, how long the arms are, the shoulder width. The other way is to try it on. Mm. And I think both are important. Like for me on my journey, I never would have picked the coat up and tried it on unless I was able to look at the dimensions of science and philosophy and history and say, yeah, that looks like it's roughly the right size. That looks reasonable. But for a season, I felt that, you know what, I'm not going to take any sort of vulnerable relational step of commitment toward God until I have all my questions answered. I have perfectly analyzed all of the dimensions, and then I will know with certainty what I want to know to such an extent that then it will be easy for me to make a faith commitment to that thing. What I actually found in my experience is that the confidence and assurance, the type of knowledge that I longed for, was actually only possible through an act of personal commitment and trust. So there does come a point in this journey where you say, yeah, this is rational. This is as rational as any other faith system or worldview that I've been able to compare it to. And yet at the end of the day, the Lord does say, taste and see, clothe yourself in Christ.
So I think we all, as Christians, are sitting back in admiration in some ways of you as a very educated Christian, someone who has a heart for engagement ever since that moment on the beach. And we all, I think, want people to know Christ the way that we do, as true and loving and full of grace. But we don't always know the best way to engage with those who really don't believe, and those who are skeptical, those who push back, And so sitting where you do now, having lived and engaged for a number of years, how would you encourage us as Christians to think about stepping out or stepping forward or engaging in a way that's meaningful as ambassadors for Christ?
I love that question. I'll try to keep it concise because this is where my heart really gets excited. When people get excited about sharing Jesus with other people, and I think the opportunities are boundless. Take a very simple question like, "How was your weekend?" How many times will you be asked that question over the course of your life, right? Say you get asked it, 5 times every Monday for the rest of your life. I mean, that's thousands and thousands of times that you're, asked the question, "How was your weekend?" And so often as Christians, we just say, "Fine, thanks. How was yours?" But if you worship the living God in the context of community on a Sunday, that's not even an honest answer, right? 1 Peter 3 tells us to be prepared to give a response to everyone who asks us for the reason for the hope that we have. And I think sometimes we take that much too narrowly. Like, okay, let me be prepared for the specific instance where someone says, "Hey, can you tell me about the hope that you have in Christ?" And we don't realize that those opportunities are there all the time. If you have worshiped the living God in the context of community on a Sunday, the question on Monday, "How was your weekend?" is an absolute gift, and it should not take you by surprise. You know full well that question's coming on Monday. So put some prayer into it, put some thought into it, that you can have this creative, engaging, not manipulative, real answer to that question on a Monday. I find that oftentimes we find it so difficult to wind up talking about Jesus in conversation because so often we're trying to get from shooting the breeze to Jesus, and that's like a big jump. But if we could spend more of our time in the middle ground of asking creative questions, having meaningful conversations about things that matter, Jesus, makes his way into those conversations quite naturally. I would say to people, I would say don't water down the faith in your desire for people to commit to Jesus. God doesn't need us to sort of be his kind of marketing campaign where we make it, more try on our own to sort of make him more appealing to people, or think, okay, if I put it this way, but don't mention that and don't mention that, maybe it'll be a little bit easier for them to sort of make this commitment. Just remember, Jesus said, whoever would come after me, be my disciple, must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. And so be honest with people. We actually use the word surrender earlier, Jen, and I think that's the right word. We do a disservice to people if we make an invitation to Christ but water it down and make them think it's something less than surrender. Because that's different. It's even different than commitment. There are lots of things I'm committed to. I'm a committed New York Yankees fan. My dad was before me. My son hopefully will be. I'll be a New York Yankees fan, the day I die. But I'm not surrendered to the New York Yankees. Right? It's a very different type of relationship, yes. And I think sometimes we have this tendency to think God needs us to sort of recalibrate his gospel or what it means to follow him in some ways. Resist that temptation. Pray for God's heart for people. I think that is so significant because, at the end of the day, God will use you when your heart breaks for the lost. So pray for that, because we all can have that. It's not something we can manifest. It's something God can give as a gift, and I believe will give to those who ask him. And then the last thing I would say is just an encouragement. An encouragement that God is always doing more than we can see, nevertheless. And not too long ago, I had an encouragement in this respect with regard to my own story. So I told you that I came to Christ in 122 Jolene Hall. That was my dorm room. Yes. That's where I dropped to my knees.
Yes.
A few years ago, I was telling my story somewhere, and I didn't normally mention that specific room number because most people, that doesn't mean anything to anyone. But I happened to say that room number, 122 Jolene Hall. And afterwards, a woman came to the front, and I could see she was tearing. She was emotional. She was moved. And she said, "Did you say 122 Jolene Hall?" And I said, "Yes, that was my dorm room." And she said, "Well, I'm about 15 years older than you, and I went to Princeton too, and I lived in 121 Jolene Hall next door." And she said, "I spent my 4 years in college praying for the salvation of the guys in 122 Jolene Hall." And she said, "All these years, I felt like God didn't hear that prayer because I never saw that prayer answered. But as you said that from the front, I realized that God not only heard my prayer, but he answered my prayer word for word for the salvation of the guys in 122 Jolene Hall." And so just the graciousness of God that 15 years before I even would have given him a second thought, he had someone literally praying for the floor on which I would drop to my knees and give my life to him. And, I guess if you're from a skeptical persuasion like I was, you could chalk that up to a very great coincidence. But maybe, and I would invite anyone who's listening, to consider the fact that maybe God is pursuing each one of us like that, where even years before we thought to give him the time of the day, he had specific people praying for us, praying for the very locations we would be in, the very times and places in which we ultimately would give our lives to him.
Mm-hmm. And how gracious, too. I'm thinking of that woman, just to bring it full circle, to allow her to see, even in this life, the effect that her prayer, it was a blessing for both of you. That didn't need to happen. what are the odds of you two, her hearing your conversion story? I don't know. The more I know about God and walk in this life, the more I'm just astounded by the way he's so personal and so intimate to reveal himself to those who are looking for him, and who are longing for him, and who have called him their own. And I'm so taken by that story, but also just, Vince, your life, and it's just such a beautiful testimony to what the Lord can do and will do in people's lives who are willing to look in his direction.
Yes, what a blessing, to think that how infrequently maybe we see that situation. She happened to be at that talk. I happened to tell that story, and we make that connection. But what a great hope to think, wow, how many times will that happen in the context of eternity? How many people will we meet, one day where we said, whoa, that happened to you. I prayed for that.
Yes, yeah.
And it gets me excited. And again, just reflecting on that story with you, it just makes me think that, so often our conception of the universe and of reality, it's so narrow. It's like, and accepting Jesus into your life, allowing him to be the bedrock of existence, there's a freedom, and it expands our imaginations for what could be possible, the way that we're connected to each other, and what it means to love each other well, and to love God well, and to be able to enjoy that in the context of community for all eternity.
Yes, I couldn't say anything that would sum up anything better than that, Vince. Thank you so very much for coming on the podcast today, for telling the fullness of your story. I feel like in some ways we've just scratched the surface. I just feel like there's so much more wisdom and experience there to glean. And I hope that those who are listening will tune in to Unbelievable, will seek out not only your ministry, but also your beautiful wife, Jo Vitale. Just such a beautiful, again, Oxford grad, just an amazingly beautiful woman of God who expresses the love of Christ and the intelligence of Christ in such compelling ways. So I just am so grateful again, and for the privilege of having spent this hour and a half with you. What a blessing.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for your ministry. Jo and I have just received your book, and we're very excited to dig into it.
Wonderful. Thanks for tuning into Side B Stories to hear Vince's story. You can find out more about him and his work and ministry and how to connect with him in the episode notes. For questions and feedback about this episode, you can contact me through our email at info@sidebstories.com. I'd like to also thank our amazing Side B Stories team for helping with this episode production. Ashley Decker, our producer, Mark Rosera, our audio engineer, and Kyle Polk, our video editor, and of course the C.S. Lewis Institute for including us in their podcast network. Also, if you are a skeptic or atheist and you would like to connect with a former atheist or skeptic with questions, please again connect with us by emailing us at info@sidebstories.com, and we'll get you connected. I hope you enjoyed this episode, that you'll follow, rate, review, and share this podcast with your friends and your social network. In the meantime, I'll be looking forward to seeing you next time, where we'll see how another skeptic flips the record of their life.